All right, and hey guys, welcome back. And for today's lecture, we're going to jump right into the thick of things. For today's lecture, we're going to be discussing the breakdown of imperial control in North America. Now, before we begin our lecture proper, I'd just like to do a quick recap to gauge us to bring it back to where we left off in our last lecture. Now, at this point, the British are in supreme control of North America. The French have been driven away. They retain only the small islands of Miquelon, which they still hold today. And it was widely understood at the time that France hadn't truly been defeated, but they had simply lost Canada. They retained their sugar islands, and they specifically requested Miquelon and the fishing rights around Miquelon has a sort of backdoor strategy to recontest British control in Canada. Now, after the 7 Years' War, Britain and France had accumulated staggering war debts. The Bank of England, the financial institutions that the English had established in the wake of the Glorious Revolution, they had preserved the monarchy and allowed the monarchy to gain access to large sums of money. But now that the war was over, the government now had to find a way to pay off all that money. And at this point, the British have created arguably the most successful army in the world. They definitely created the most successful army of the 18th century. Um, and a major source of contention would be that since 1689 and the ousting of James the Seventh and Second, there had been no attempt to really regulate what the colonies were doing. James the Seventh and Second had reorganized the Puritan colonies in New England and designated them had the Dominion of New England, and to sort of counteract any sort of attempts by the New England colonies to try to slip away and use financial leverage to control any sort of new governor going out there. He added his personal property, the now royal colony of New York, to it. So it cut off any sort of attempts to control any new colonial governors and so forth. It also wiped away all of the existing laws on the colonial books because now they were governed solely by the Duke's Law, which strictly forbade the introduction of a legislature. The only laws allowed were the laws that the Duke allowed his representatives to pass, and they weren't passing any laws that would grant citizens any sort of rights. James very firmly believed in the divine rights of kings, and as a divinely appointed figure, he would have no need to consult with colonists on how best to govern. Now, getting to the thick of things. After the war, the British faced a massive native uprising in the lands south of the St. Lawrence, one from France. And these lands were populated by peoples who had long been allied to the French. Uh, so, in order to end the hostilities, the British prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Proclamation Line of 1763, as it is known. This hurt the colonists internally. Their legislature's powers rested on their ability to control the governors through the powers of the purse. The elites controlled the assemblies, the colonial legislatures, and they were not willing to tax themselves on a regular basis. They provided the money needed to run the government through land speculation. That is, going onto land where nobody lived, drawing it up into plots and lots, and selling it to new settlers and to other elites who were expanding their plantation operations. This generated more than enough money for them to meet their own needs and the needs of the colonial governors. Now, Now, with the western lands closed off to them, they felt that the proclamation line deprived them of the fruits of their wartime labor. They felt that they had been a active participant and a willing contributor to the British war effort in the Great War for Empire in the 7 Years' War, and that by closing off these lands to them, they felt that they were being unfairly treated and indeed cheated by the royal government. Now, with the western lands being closed off to them, they will be unable to fund their colonial governments and either have to tax themselves or lose their peculiar political rights. Now, the Yankee persona of the shrewd, calculating businessman, which pretty much exemplify which was pretty much exemplified by the colonial elite's fiscal leverage over the governors, was challenged by this. The governor were forced to walk a tightrope. That is, they were caught between following London's orders to not recognize these legislatures and being able to perform their duties as governors only by recognizing these legislatures. Now, with Trans-Appalachian settlement barred, the British hoped that new settlers would move to either Canada in the north or the Floridas in the south, which had just been won from Spain. Now, there was a lot of resistance from settlers to either of these options because of the intense cold of Canada and the fears of contracting malaria in Florida. Much of Florida was simply swamps at this time. The Florida that we know really didn't come about until the mid 1820s, 1830s, and later 20th century. Now, another fact compounding moving to either Canada or the Floridas was that Canada and the Floridas had no legislature, nor would they ever have a legislature. There was a very strong military presence in both of these colonies, and they had able royal administrators who were not interested in establishing a colonial legislature or bowing to pressure from colonists. And now, the real crux of the matter after the war for the British was the debt. The post-war debt was staggering. To finance a world war, the British government accumulated a war debt of over 100 million pounds. The interest on the debt was 4.5 million pounds alone, which was roughly 60% of the British government's yearly revenue at the time. To compound things, to make matters worse, the British budget had never been more than 8 million pounds a year. The government debt actually rose from 74 million pounds in 1755 to 132 million pounds in 1763. The government could not tax the home population because they were already the second most heavily taxed people in Europe after the French peasantry. The government and the home population could not shoulder this debt alone. None of those costs even really touched the continuing cost of government, like the upkeep of the army and the navy. Even a skeleton force for protection and internal garrisoning cost the government roughly £200,000 a year. Now, the plan to pay off the national debt was to build a large royal bureaucracy, to collect taxes supported by a large naval presence to enforce the navigation acts of the 1660s and 1670s passed under the reign of Charles II. Now, the British government began to clamp down heavily on colonial smuggling, which they observed quite regularity during the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. The American colonists openly traded with imperial competitors and adversaries, most notably the French. From the colonist point of view, the Navigation Acts would have, with all likelihood, destroyed the colonial economies. They survived because they created cash crops and distributed those cash crops and manufactured goods to whoever was willing to buy them. That's how they were able to support themselves first. First support their families, their communities, and then their colonies. Now, after the 7 Years' War, the young King George III relieved William Pitt, the architect of the British drive to victory, from his responsibilities as Prime Minister. He then appointed George Grenville as Prime Minister. Now, Grenville has a reputation as a monster and a tyrannical despot, a lickspittle to King George III, but really, he was neither of those things. He was, however, a committed mercantilist, and he did believe that the colonies should be brought in line to bear their fair share of the imperial war debt. After all, the war had largely been fought on the main drive for victory has largely been fought for the colonists' benefaction. They benefited from the curtailment of hostile natives, and they benefited from the removal of the French and Spanish threat to their home colonies. Now, with that being said, his government decided that the revenue should be recouped by taxation. His solution to the crisis was to levy direct taxes on the overseas colonies, not just the colonies that would rebel and make up the United States, but all of the colonies, including the Canadian colonies, the West Indian colonies. And now this was the first economic regulatory act, or the first economic regulatory acts passed since the disposition of James the Seventh. The Stamp Act was to become the most detested of all. By 1765, all of these acts were in place or about to come into full effect. Now, Grenville had severely underestimated the impact of his actions. Since 1689, all the colonists had used financial means to control their royal governors and put in place their peculiar colonial legislatures. Now, the royal governors were forced to acknowledge the legislatures in order to receive a salary for themselves and the funds necessary to conduct the yearly governing, the yearly ordinance of the colonies. Uh, the colonists, very well aware of the position of power they operated from, they used their position to bind the governor to only pass laws with the consent and in the legislatures, much like Parliament had done with the kings since 1689. They resented the imposition of taxes not passed by their legislatures, even though the legislatures had no legal standing and were unacknowledged by the king or the British Parliament. Now, Parliament was the legislature of the British Empire. The great viewpoint was that the colonies were only plantations, not miniature political regimes in their own right. Now, the introduction of direct taxes was at first greeted with shocked silence, then furious outrage. The colonies bowed to parliamentary regulation on the seas and around the world because imperial policy was set by Parliament at home and abroad, on the seas and abroad. To them, the government in London had no just cause to tax them at home. This was to them an attempt to bypass their colonial legislatures as though they did not exist and meddle in the internal politics and economies of the colonies. It was a severe blow to the colonists. Since they had no say in the British Parliament, taxing them was tyranny. It was a violation of their liberties as Englishmen. Since they had no say in the Parliament, it was widely viewed as an opportunity, as the opening move, and what would eventually mean royal officials taxing them, relieving them of the need to call a colonial assembly, to call on colonial legislatures in the future. Now, James Otis of Massachusetts called for an intercolonial conference, the first since the Albany Conference in 1754, to be held in New York City and discuss these events. Nine of the British North American colonies sent representatives to New York City, to what became known as the Stamp Act Congress. Now, the colonists resented Parliament's claim to tax them, and they also resented the parliamentary claim that they were only plantations. Uh, to them, they could only be taxed by their legislatures. They were proud and loyal Englishmen, but they only believed that they could be taxed by their own legislatures. Parliament's response was to say that the colonists held virtual representation. And this was not a snide retort by the members of Parliament. This was meant in all sincerity. There were a number of burgeoning manufacturing centers like Manchester and Birmingham that had absolutely no representation in Parliament, and areas with no population that had a number of members in Parliament. Parliament's view was that even though someone may be elected from another constituency, they held the best interests of all people in the British Empire in their hearts, and that they strove to endeavor to provide fair justice to all. Now, the Stamp Act Congress met in 1765 to discuss what to do. Their plan was to boycott all British goods, and by doing so, they would skirt around the tax. They issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances to the British Parliament for redress. It was composed by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, and in it he argued that the colonies were not simply mere plantations, but constituent members of the British Empire, whose people could only be taxed by their individual colonial legislatures, not the Parliament at Westminster. At this time, there was also a breakout of mob violence against the royal revenue collectors. All the stamp tax officials were cowed into submission before the act even came into effect. Now, to take a step back and just look at the overall situation, the American colonists were the least taxed people in the world at this time. The average Englishman paid 26 shillings a year in taxes. The Americans paid, by contrast, 1 shilling a year. They were better educated than their contemporaries in Britain. The elites, only the charmed few in the American colonies bridled at the taxes. They threw off the yoke of imperial authority, not the common laborer, not the slave on the plantation or in the house. They threw off the yoke of imperial authority as an assault on their liberty. The colonists continually applied their understanding of the traditional rights of Englishmen in their struggle with King George III, his ministers, and Parliament. They came to view the king as attempting to do what the Stuart kings had done in imposing royal authority over the colonies before 1689. Now, even though the British were more balanced and less tyrannical than other European monarchies. This includes the Spanish, the German monarchies, who had a particular reputation for repression, and the French monarchy, perhaps symbolized the absolute, the divine right of kings best. The French kings ruled with no legislature; they simply did what they want because they were the elect of God. And then that is the principle of the divine right to kings. Kings do what they want on God because they are God's representatives on earth. And now the British position, and British sentiment overall was best summed up by Dr. Samuel Johnson, who retorted to the protests generated in America by saying, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" And that was to be the revolutions, and later the United States' paradox. A fight for liberty was perpetrated by those who openly denied liberty to others. Now, Grenville's ministry collapsed in the wake of such opposition, and he was replaced by Charles Watson Wentworth, the Marquess of Rockingham. Now, Lord Rockingham organized a government that duly repealed the offensive revenue-gathering acts, but a shiver of fear still remained in the colonies at this attempt to curtail their liberties. They were now on high alert to parliamentary overtures to regulate them. Religious separatists primarily in Massachusetts and the other New England colonies. But religious separatists also held fears that a Church of England bishop will be sent to the colonies and institute the first wave of the home government's attempt to introduce the Church of England into their colonies. Now, this had already happened in South Carolina, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, New York. The Church of England was established as royal colonies. Georgia and Virginia, they didn't have a bishop, but the Church of England was understood to be the church, the governing church, the only legitimate church, the only real church in those colonies. The other colonies founded by religious separatists, they were naturally afraid that it would happen to them, especially since the legislatures were being curtailed. Now, the British held that they could regulate the colonies economically. The repeal of the Stamp Act did not mean that they could not tax or legislate on behalf of the colonies in their opinion. Now, in 1766, Lord Rockingham yielded control of the government to Pitt the Elder, who came back as prime minister. But at this point, Pitt was desperately ill, and real power was held by Charles Townshend. Now, Townshend was a thorough politician, but he only viewed the problem through London's end. In 1767, he introduced a series of bills that will become known collectively as the Townshend Acts, which was a new tax scheme. He suspected that the opposition to the previous acts was generated because the government directly taxed the colonial elites, lawyers, southern slave owners, and merchants. Townshend aimed his new taxes at innocuous items like paper, glass, and tea. The opposition to this was only partly money related and partly political. The new taxes were not greeted warmly either by the colonists. Sam Adams, a colonial radical, issued a circular letter that was broadly endorsed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony's legislature. And this resulted in its closure by its royal governor, Francis Bernard. Now, all of these came to a head when the 14th and the 29th Foot regiments were dispatched to patrol the streets of Boston. They, upon arrival, began to hold band concerts on Sunday. They took moonlighting jobs at the docks and stood guard duty, daring the Bostonians in their own backyard, in their own home, to do something. Now, all of these actions unintentionally antagonized the Bostonians. And now at this point, there arose two different opinions amongst African Americans. Now, the Black Patriots sided with the ideas of the revolutionaries. They found a common cause in the belief that freedom and liberty would soon come to them if they joined the revolution, if they joined in this upswing in popular opinion in the colonies. They believed in the opportunity for a better life if the colonies stood firm and made Great Britain back down. Now, Bostonian anger gave rise to open taunting in the streets, and this taunting culminated in the events of June 5th, 1770, when a mob encircled a patrol squad of British regulars and initiated violence. They became unruly, they started throwing things and yelling, made the entire scene chaotic. This led the soldiers to fire upon the mob, and in doing so, they killed a small number, less than 10, but they killed a number of colonists. One such colonist was Crispus Attucks, a half-black, half-native dock worker who was at the disturbance of March 5th, joining in with the European Bostonians in protesting what Great Britain was doing. Now, he was the first to die when the soldier fired into the crowd. Now, the soldiers, rather than simply, walking away scot-free, they were brought up on manslaughter charges, and made to hell trial made to stand trial in Boston, in a law court in Boston, and they were acquitted of all wrongdoing, and they were defended by John Adams. This was an attempt by the British government to show that they did care about the colonies and that the grievances of the colonies were well understood by Parliament, and that Parliament was endeavoring to make the empire better for citizens in Great Britain and citizens abroad. Now, the Pitt government fell, and Frederick North, second Earl of Guildford, came to power in London and formed a new government that repealed the Townshend Acts except for the Tea Act. Now, the colonists smarted, and smarted is simply, another way of saying they they were angered by Parliament's insistence that they could regulate the colonies without consulting their legislatures. This led to a continuing boycott of British tea. Now, the Tea Act actually lowered prices across the empire for tea. It made a luxury item, which tea was, more widely available to the common population. Moreover, it had nothing to do with the American problems. The Tea Act was enacted to save the bankrupt East India Company from simply falling apart, and to save London the burden of governing their outpost in India. The colonists, still on high alert, were sure this was a trick by London to prove that they could regulate the colonies. Now, the colonial response to the Tea Act was to threaten ship captains with violence, most notoriously tar and feathering, which involved burning the victim with hot tar and then dumping feathers on the victim as they writhed from their burns. Several tea parties broke out in numerous cities, from the Chesapeake all the way up to Massachusetts Bay. And the tea parties constituted colonists simply storming ships, going down to the cargo holds, and dumping the chests of tea into their local bays, into the harbors, and then running away, and then running back home. The most famous of these tea parties was undoubtedly, or is undoubtedly, the Boston Tea Party, in which the citizens of Boston, a few of them, not all of them, but a few of them dressed up as Mohawk Indians, Mohawk natives. The Mohawks were members of the Iroquois League. They dressed up as them and dumped tea into Boston Harbor. Luckily for the merchants, the tide was out at the time, and they were able to recover a majority of their cargo. Now, Parliament's response to what was happening, to all of the protests to the Tea Act, Parliament's response was to put its foot down and issue a series of prohibitory punitive bills, the coercive or intolerable acts, as they're known. And these acts closed down Boston until restitution was made to the merchant ships. It installed Thomas Gage as a military governor of Boston, and in response to the British putting their foot down, the colonies decided to meet at what became known as the First Continental Congress, and they decided to resolve what was known as the Sussex Resolves, in which they denied that Parliament ever had the right to legislate on their behalf. They also decided to throw open not just Boston, but all of the colonial ports open to the world. This is because the Navigation Acts are no longer in effect for them, because the Navigation Act was passed by Parliament and upheld by Parliament. No colonial legislature had passed the Navigation Act, and in doing so, they made the first political break. This was the first political break with Great Britain. Independence from the British Parliament. At this point, they are still loyal Englishmen, loyal to the king. Now, the Massachusetts legislature had been closed by Governor Francis Bernard on orders from the British Parliament. Since the colonies had broadly shaken off British colonial authority, it was only natural that the only legitimate pan-colonial legislative authority, the Continental Congress, it was only logical in the minds of the Massachusetts citizens that they should appeal to them, to the Continental Congress, for redress, for the right to reconstitute a colonial assembly, a Massachusetts assembly, and send new delegates from this new Massachusetts colonial assembly to the Continental Congress. Now, in doing so, they met in secret. They rebranded themselves the Provincial Convention of Massachusetts, and they resolved to capture British stockpile weapons. They resolved to stockpile weapons, I should say, and drive the British out of Boston. Now, the British, once finding out about this, they decided to capture those stockpile weapons in addition to Sam Adams and John Hancock's, two of the ringleaders of what was now becoming a burgeoning rebellion against the royal government. They decided to head out to Lexington and Concord, where they were met by Massachusetts colonial militiamen. And at Lexington, the militiamen and the regulars exchanged fire. Now, the militiamen fled at Lexington, and when the regulars approached Lexington, they found that John Hancock and Sam Adams had already escaped. They escaped during the action. They proceeded then to Concord, where a larger militia force who had been told of what had happened at Lexington were now angry, and they were ready to fight the British. Now, the British assembled their forces and fell back. And on the way home, they were simply hounded by the Massachusetts militiamen, who fired into their ranks, causing the British to sustain heavy losses on their retreat back to Boston. Now, the imperial fiscal crisis had now coincided with political legislative rights that created a calamity. The British government's debt was nearly crippling the empire, and opinions were divided on how best to deal with the colonial opposition to the imposition of new taxes. It was widely understood that concession would only lead to more demands, and non-compliance, which the colonists were demonstrated, would only promote future confrontations. Now, most people thought that the colonists were simply ungrateful. They were the least taxed people on the earth, and all of the British past actions had only been undertaken to secure their liberty and their right to live peaceably under the king. The British were slow to understand that the colonists' fears were generated by the British government's theme of lack of understanding of what the Revolution of 1689 had meant. The king couldn't really do what he wanted to anybody, and if the king couldn't do what he wanted to anybody at any time, neither could a legislature. At this time, there were still transplanted Englishmen. They simply were transplanted Englishmen who did not obey the laws of Parliament. They were still loyal to the king, but they were free of Parliament. And in summary, before we break, I would simply like to say that the colonial resentment was primarily generated by lingering fears and lingering memories of the Stuart clampdown. The Stuart kings had, throughout the course of their rule in Great Britain and Great Britain's colonies, had always sought to regulate the the colonies. The colonies were never just simply out in the wilderness. They had someone watching them from London. They had someone supervising what they were doing. And the Stuart Kings took every opportunity to reinforce their royal authority, their royal power in the colonies. The Tea Parties and the actions at Lexington and Concord were fresh to everybody. They they were not yet really harbingers of any great imperial rebellion. They were simply a series uh, of rising and mounting problems, a widening of the gap, if you will, between the British understanding and the colonial understanding. And most importantly, the British government was very unstable. We'd seen four different governments rise and fall during the time period. We saw Grenville government fall. We saw Rockingham government fall. We saw Pitt's government, which was really led by Townshend, fall. And now we have Lord North on the scene, trying to deal with everything. And with that being said, we'll break here. And as always, I want you guys to hit like, subscribe, comment, and let me know what you thought about the breakdown of imperial authority. As always, I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys later for another lecture.